wide receivers that you should be starting or sitting going into week 10 of the fantasy football season. We are only 4 weeks away until the fantasy playoffs, 8 weeks away until the season ends and going into the real playoffs. So much football left to be played, but it's all going so fast. So let's not take it for granted. Starting off with the bye weeks, okay? Chiefs, Rams, Dolphins, Eagles. At the wide receiver position, you're going to be missing some key pieces here. So what do you think of Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, Rashee Rice, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, A.J. Brown, and Devonta Smith are all going to be missing out of your lineups going into week 10. So make sure you plan accordingly. Let's go straight into our Thursday night matchup here. We have a nail biter, okay? I mean, everyone should be tuning in on Thursday night, and that is the Panthers versus the Chicago Bears. Starting at the wide receiver position, obviously, look, Adam Thielen is doing his thing. He's currently wide receiver 7. He did have a dud week coming, or against the Indianapolis Colts this past week with under 8 fantasy points, which is not exactly what we were hoping for with Adam Thielen. But look, he is somebody that you continue to start. He is continuing getting targets as well. He had his second lowest target share, but the thing is, nothing's changed. It's not like he is getting outsnapped or out-targeted in other areas like Jonathan Mingo or Terrace Marshall, DJ Chark. No, that's not the case. They just struggled at the wide receiver position or just moving the ball down the field. Obviously, we saw Bryce Young struggle. But at the Chicago Bears side of the ball, the only person I am comfortable starting is DJ Moore. Now, there is a caveat here. I don't believe he is a must-start, but as you can see right now, I do have him as a must-start if Justin Fields plays. As I'm recording this, we don't know what's the timeline for Justin Fields. I do believe he could be trending in the right direction to play on Thursday night. But if he doesn't play, I do have, DJ Moore as a spot start, somebody that, there are some better options out there. But if you don't have another options because you are struggling at the wide receiver position, then I understand, DJ Moore could be a start for you. I mean, you think about it, the past 2 weeks, scored both under 10 fantasy points against the Chargers, against New Orleans. Against Vegas, he had a decent game with over double-digit fantasy points. But look, you have to hope and expect that there's going to be better days ahead for DJ Moore and Tyson Bagent, I like to call him, and or obviously Justin Fields when he does come back. And everyone else I am not going to be starting going into this game. All right, our second matchup in Deutschland, in Germany. The Indianapolis Colts versus the New England Patriots, another nail biter. I mean, I definitely am not going to be staying up to watch this game over here. Obviously, we wake up in the middle of the night to watch these games. This is a game I am not going to get up for. But look, this one's very interesting because the over-under is pretty high, 43.5. I found that pretty high for this team here, but the Colts have been scoring. Starting at the Colts side of the ball here, you start Michael Pittman, wide receiver 11, coming into the season so far in 9 weeks. Scored 8 out of 8 targets, over 14 fantasy points against the Carolina Panthers this week. And then look, Josh Downs, if he does play, I think he is a good spot start at the moment. He was ruled out in week 9 in the middle of the game with that knee injury. And if he is trending towards the right direction to play, then I think he could be a good spot start coming into this week. But obviously, you don't play him if he doesn't play, of course. Going to the New England side of the ball, this is kind of a jumble, right? I do have Demario Douglas as a risky start here. He did get his second double-digit point game against the Washington Commanders, catching 5 out of 7 targets for over 10 fantasy points. And look, his highest percentage snap as well. And look, the Colts at the moment, they're a middle of the pack defense. We saw once again the Carolina Panthers struggle this past week, but you never know with these games. Anything can happen. An overseas game, some of these players are off their rhythm, or maybe the Colts are just coming off a high, so they just might dominate here. But I do have him as a risky start if you are in a deeper league or if you are struggling with all these bye weeks. He could be a risky start coming in for you going into week 10 of the fantasy football season. All right, our next matchup here is the Browns at the Baltimore Ravens. This is a divisional matchup. The Ravens are favored 38.5 here, a lower over-under, but I think it's because both of these defenses are playing pretty good so far. Starting at the Browns side of the ball, you are starting Amari Cooper with Deshaun Watson back. You see the uptick in production. You see the higher upside that he has with Deshaun Watson's on the field. Called 5 out of 5, 139 yards and a touchdown, over 24 fantasy points. Let's hope that Deshaun Watson does stay healthy, and he could be the guy for Amari Cooper. Elijah Moore, you are not starting, unfortunately. And going to the Ravens side of the ball here, Zay Flowers. I know he has been a disappointment these past 2 weeks, but you have to think about it. This team was up in both of these games. I know the Arizona Cardinals, they kind of came back in the last minute, but they dominated on the ground. And I think that's exactly what you have to take into account here. Now, the Cleveland Browns do give up the second least amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. But you have to understand, the last time Zay Flowers did play this team, he scored over 8 fantasy points, and this was when he was still getting worked in. Now he has full swing. We understand what that workload looks like. I do believe he can have a big bounce back game because he could be needed, right? You think about the games, right? Think of the last 3 games. Detroit, a blowout, but he scored over 11 fantasy points. The Arizona Cardinals, they were running the ball all over. Gus Edwards had a crazy game as well, and they were up and had a lead. They didn't need Zay Flowers. Seattle Seahawks, he only caught 1 pass. He had 2 fantasy points. They didn't need Zay Flowers then either. So I think a lot of people are maybe up and down. And yes, I think our expectation for some of these games were a little bit different. For the Detroit Lions game, we expected a shootout. That wasn't the case. For Arizona Cardinals game, we expected that he was going to have a lower performing game because we expected this Baltimore Raven to perform really well. And the Seattle Seahawks, once again, skewed expectations because we thought the Seattle Seahawks was going to be a shootout game. That just wasn't the case this week. So I do believe Zay Flowers is a must-start coming into this game because the Cleveland Browns are a pretty good defense, and one of these teams are going to need to score. Cleveland Browns are really good against the run. And we all know how Lamar can perform against the Browns, either really good or really bad. But I'm still leaning on the talent with Zay Flowers. I do believe you can see a big week from Zay. So he is a must-start going into this week. And yes, I know OBJ had a big game, and he had one of his biggest target shares per game, right? I just don't expect him. I don't expect that to continue as the season goes along. So I am going to be sitting him going into week 10. All right, our next matchup here, Texans at the Bengals. The over-under is 45.5. The Bengals are favored. And shout out to CJ Stroud, who balled out this past week. Man, it was incredible to watch that performance, him coming back. And let's see what he can do against the Bengals. I want to see what he could do blow for blow with one of these high caliber quarterbacks, like someone like a Joe Burrow. I'm not saying he's not going to do it. I'm saying I'm just excited to see it. Okay. On the Texans side of the ball, obviously you start Nico Collins and Tank Dell. I think moving forward, you have to trust that, CJ Stroud is going to be feeding these guys the ball, especially in these matchups that are going to be competitive, right? You have to pick and choose which matchup is going to be competitive to where you're going to be able to start Nico and Tank Dell. But this week, going into week 10, going against the Cincinnati Bengals, you have to start both of these guys who have been performing pretty well. Obviously, Nico this past week, over 14 fantasy points. He finds the end zone. Tank Dell, over 29 fantasy points. He finds the end zone twice, but led the team in targets. So that is something really excited to see here. Going to the Bengals side of the ball, you start all these guys. You start Jamar Chase. You start T. Higgins. Obviously, T. Higgins had a good bounce back game. 8 out of 9 targets, over 100 yards. And Jamar Chase, he didn't have the best game. But in reality, did they really need to include Jamar Chase? Yes, there was points and times where they were struggling a little bit, but they always had the lead. They always felt comfortable, and they were moving the ball pretty well here. But you start Jamar Chase going versus the Houston Texans here, and you sit Tyler Boyd, obviously. Both of these teams should be a good shootout, so I'm really excited to watch this game going into week 10. Okay, next matchup here, San Francisco 49ers at the Jacksonville Jaguars. I think this one is also pretty simple on the San Francisco side of the ball. You start Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk here. This is also another high-scoring game, 44.5. Is the over-under coming into this game with the San Francisco 49ers being the favorites. But yeah, you start your stars on the 49ers side of the ball at the wide receiver position. I think the biggest conversation here is Calvin Ridley. I think a lot of people are still a little bit up and down with Calvin. He did have a better bounce back game against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Before in week 8, he caught 6 out of 10 targets for over 14 fantasy points, and that was in the pouring rain. So I think you can see a better bounce back game here. I think they put a little bit of emphasis on them trying to get Calvin really integrated into this offense. And the same thing with Christian Kirk. I think you can continue to trust him. His second lowest outing against the Pittsburgh Steelers, when he caught 4 out of 5 targets for under 9 fantasy points, excuse me. I still believe he'll have a bounce back game. The San Francisco 49ers currently give up the 12th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Keep in mind, they did have a bye, so that kind of skews their points to go a little bit higher, the points that they have given. So look, we'll wait and see what happens against this game. But I would also say for Zay Jones, he's also a candidate to potentially go on IR. We haven't seen or heard too much information about it. He didn't go on IR before the bye week, which I'm really interested why he didn't, but probably because if he didn't get better, then he has to miss those next 4 games, and the bye week is not considered as a week. So it's like, well, what's the point of putting him in IR if he can technically heal up a little bit more, get treatment, see what he can do during that bye week? But he is a must sit, and I'm still starting Christian Kirk with confidence there. So that is me for this matchup. All right, our next matchup here is the Saints at the Minnesota Vikings. The over-under is 41, and the Saints are favored coming into this game. And starting at the Saints side of the ball here, Chris Olave having a good bounce-back week here, catching 6 out of 8 targets, over 40 yards and a touchdown, over 16 fantasy points here. Exactly what we were hoping and expecting as he was playing the Chicago Bears. And now you think of his teammates here, Michael Thomas and Rashid Shaheed. Michael Thomas is a spot star for me. He did have one of his worst outings this year, only seeing 1 target, no fantasy points. I would argue he was really not needed in this matchup here. So going into the Vikings this week, let's see how Joshua Dobbs, I guess, works out, right, with this Vikings team. Obviously, he had an incredible win this past week against the Atlanta Falcons. Thank you so much. Fire Arthur Smith. Hashtag Fire Arthur Smith. But look, Michael Thomas, I think he could be a good spot star here. Once again, he's been averaging just 11, 10 fantasy points per game if you do need a flex option and struggling at the wide receiver position. And the other guy here is Rashid Shaheed. Is a risky start, but he could be a high upside play here because the Vikings do give the 7th most amount of points to the wide receiver position. Not somebody I'm excited to start, but if you're in a deeper league, 14, 16, or bigger, I can see why you should be starting, or why you could be starting Rashid Shaheed here. And I think the only one I'm comfortable starting on the Viking side of the ball in the wide receiver position is Jordan Addison. We saw what he did with Josh Dobbs. He had over double-digit fantasy points, 5 out of 7 targets. And as they continue to get acclimated, as we saw, right? We saw Josh Dobbs come out in week 2 when he was only with the team before in week 1 for a couple days, right? And then he was slinging it against my Giants. And then obviously they lost. He was looking like a freaking star. But I think this is exactly what you can see here again. Another week acclimated with this team, understanding the offense, understanding the routes, understanding, the nuances, him having conversations with these skill players, excuse me. So Jordan Addison is a must start coming into this week, even though, the Saints are pretty good against the wide receiver position here. So start Jordan Addison with confidence. Okay, our next matchup coming into this week, Packers at the Steelers. The Steelers are favored coming into this week here. And at the wide receiver position for the Green Bay Packers is not exciting whatsoever, okay? You think of all 3 of these guys you can see on your screen, Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, and Jalen Reed. I genuinely cannot tell you who you should be starting in this matchup. Christian Watson has been an absolute disappointment. I mean, the last 3 matchups, 5 fantasy points, 6 fantasy points, 4 fantasy points. And he saw a high target percentage or target seen in week 8 against the Minnesota Vikings, but he just hasn't been doing exactly what I wanted him to do. And I'm not excited to start him. I do believe there are better, there are better options for you to start going into week 10. This is why I have him as a risky start. I have all these guys as risky starts. I don't think you can really start these guys with confidence. Now, if you're struggling at the bye week, the best person to start here that has the highest upside is Christian Watson, right? I mean, we've seen those opportunities where he gets target in the end zone, or he gets, that deep, 40, 50-yard bomb that Jordan Love tries to get to him, just can't connect. If he connects with one of those just in one game, in this game specifically, because the Steelers do give the fourth most amount of points to the wide receiver position, that could happen. But I am not excited to start any one of these guys. That's why I do, once again, have him as a risky start coming into this week. Now going to the Steelers side of the ball here, you think of George Pickens, who did come off a terrible game, only seeing catching 2 out of 5 targets under 1 fantasy point. I think he can have a bounce back here. Obviously, he voiced his frustration this past week. Even though they got the win, he was frustrated, saying, "Free me." Maybe that is something that we can see coming into this week. I do have him as someone that is a spot start coming in. He is definitely, I would say I'm starting George Pickens over all these guys, as on the other side in Christian Watson, Reed, and Dobbs. So keep that in mind. So a spot start for George Pickens and a must start for Deontay Johnson, who's just he's coming back, baby. Finally scored a touchdown since 2021. The last quarterback to throw him a touchdown was Ben Roethlisberger, which is absolutely crazy. Caught 7 out of 9 targets, over 22 fantasy points. This is exactly what we wanted to see here. So you start Deontay Johnson with confidence. All right, our next matchup here, the Titans at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Starting off at the Titans side of the ball here, Will Levis is showing up and making me want to start DeAndre Hopkins because of what we've been seeing in the past couple of weeks. Look, obviously against Atlanta, 34 fantasy points, double-digit points against the Pittsburgh Steelers, 4 out of 11 targets. Is still a little bit inconsistent, but we can see a better opportunity here as the Tampa Bay Buccaneers give up the second most amount of points to the wide receiver position. So that can be absolutely phenomenal coming into this week. On the Bucs side of the ball, you start Mike Evans, who is still a top 13 wide receiver in the league. Caught 4 out of 5 targets, over 12 fantasy points. And the Titans also give the 6th most amount of points to the wide receiver position. And Chris Godwin, somebody that didn't have the best game this past week. Look, the Texans, are a top 5 defense when it comes down to the wide receiver position. So they don't give up a lot of points. But I do believe this could be a good bounce back game for Chris Godwin versus the Tennessee Titans. Once again, who currently give up the 6th most amount of points to the wide receiver position. The over-under is 35.5 here. And the Bucs are favored coming into this game. So could be a very interesting matchup where Will Levis and Baker Mayfield could be having a nice little shootout here. So I will be starting Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and DeAndre Hopkins with confidence coming into this week. Okay, the start of our afternoon games here. Falcons at the Arizona Cardinals. Who is excited for this one? Because Kyler Murray, the cockroach himself, is back. He has been announced the starter going into week 10. And look, this could be very, very good for some of these players coming into this match. Let's start at the Falcons side of the ball here. Taylor Heineke is still the starting quarterback here, and we still haven't seen a full game with Drake London with Taylor Heineke. The Cardinals currently give the 11th most amount of points to the wide receiver position. If Drake London does clear, these injuries and he does come back for week 10, he can definitely be somebody I'm going to be starting with confidence. So keep that in mind. And if he doesn't start, I'm not starting anyone else with confidence. At the Cardinals side of the ball, I think the only one we can't start with confidence that is exciting is Hollywood Brown. Wide receiver 20. We saw what Josh Dobbs did with Hollywood, and now he's back with his old college buddy in Kyler Murray. This is something that could be really good. And we saw what Kyler Murray and Hollywood Brown has been in the first 6 weeks of last year. First 6 weeks of the season, Hollywood Brown was a top 5 wide receiver, and he was averaging over 18 fantasy points per game. If Kyler Murray can get a swing of things right now in week 10, maybe this could be a good matchup for Kyler Murray and Hollywood Brown. So keep that in mind, guys. Those are my startups for this matchup. All right, next matchup coming into this week, Lions at the Chargers. Lions are favored coming into this week. One of the highest over-unders of the week with 48.5. Starting at the Lions side of the ball, you really understand, you have to understand there's no one really comfortable to start outside of Amon-Ra. Amon-Ra is the only must-start wide receiver on this team. He's still a top 10 wide receiver. They're just coming off their bye week, and they're getting David Montgomery back, which could be very deadly here currently. The Los Angeles Chargers give up the 8th most amount of points to the wide receiver position. So they've kind of been fluctuating for these past couple of weeks here. So keep that in mind as well. I mean, they have been giving a lot of points outside of this week, before week 10, They have been giving the most amount of points to the wide receiver position. Now, obviously, after week 9, things have changed. Now they give up the 8th most points to the wide receiver position. So I do believe Amon-Ra is going to eat. Josh Reynolds, you're not starting, and Jameson, you are not starting. You just can't start any of these guys with confidence, to be completely honest. Going to the other side of the ball with Keenan Allen here. You start Keenan Allen. Look, he kind of saved his day with these last couple catches versus the Jets here. Call 8 out of 9 over 15 fantasy points here. You start him. He's top 9 wide receiver currently so far, and everyone else you're not starting. You're not starting Quinton. Look, I'm still excited to see how Quinton's still getting utilized just a little bit, but he wasn't able to get utilized against the Jets on that Monday night game because they were up 14-0 in the first quarter, and then they just started to run the ball. The Jets couldn't get anything done. So this one could be a good matchup for Quentin Johnston. This could be a good spot start if you do need him, but I'm not someone that is going to be saying that you should start him. So I do have him as a must sit, but I understand if you have to start him if you are struggling with these injuries. And obviously Josh Palmer is on IR. Going into our next matchup here, Giants at the Cowboys here. Let's keep this one short and sweet. You're not starting anyone at the Giants side of the ball here. Have a backup quarterback, Matt Barkley and or Tommy DeVito, either or. I think they're going to take shots and give some of these young players some playing time, but you can't start any of these guys with confidence. I know Wanda Robinson found the end zone this past week. Just not something that you want to see. Maybe Jalen Hyatt gets 2 deep balls. Hopefully he catches the ball. Whatever the case may be, not something that I'm willing or wanting to start on the Giants side of the ball. And the only wide receiver I'm excited to start on the Cowboys side of the ball is CeeDee Lamb. Currently wide receiver 5. Had a phenomenal game against Philly. 11 out of 16 targets, over 191 yards, almost 200 yards on the day for CeeDee Lamb. 3 games these past 3 weeks with over 115 yards. Week 6, over 117. Week 8, 158. Week 9, 191. Now, the Giants do give the 13th most amount of points to the wide receiver position. This is a divisional game. We all know how this works. This is a good bounce back game for the Dallas Cowboys, and they are favored coming into this week. Don't have high expectations for CeeDee Lamb. I would think you should be having more high expectations at the running back position for the Dallas Cowboys. So keep that in mind, guys. CeeDee Lamb is truly the only wide receiver you should be starting with confidence coming into this week. All right, our next matchup of this week is Washington at the Seattle Seahawks. The Seahawks are favored 45.5. And let's start at the Washington side of the ball because I think there's a lot of information to go over there first. I mean, you start Terry with confidence. He's been, I feel like, the most consistent wide receiver for this offense for Sam Howell so far. Wide receiver 17 on the year. But you go to Curtis Samuel and Jahan Dotson. These two guys are tricky. Okay, Curtis Samuel obviously was ruled out this week. He did not play. And if Curtis Samuel is ruled out again, I am starting Jahan Dotson with confidence. But if Curtis Samuel plays going into week 10 and he's saying he's a full participation, he should be back into the lineup, he should be fine, I am not necessarily sure if Jahan Dotson could be somebody that I'm going to be starting with confidence. I would deem him more as a risky start if Curtis Samuel does play. Now, if Curtis Samuel does play, I do believe he is also a risky start coming into this week. I think both of these guys can offset each other, unfortunately. But the biggest caveat here is that the Seattle Seahawks give up the 9th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. This is why Jahan Dotson improving is making things a little bit more complicated because it's clear that it's because of Curtis Samuel. But once again, if both of those guys start, then it makes it even more cloudy. But if it doesn't, then you start Jahan Dotson with confidence. Going to the Seattle side of the ball here, I think it's very similar with the other 3 in Washington. DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and Jackson Smith and Jigba. Look, DK Metcalf hasn't been performing the way we all hoped for. You know, I mean, you think of these last couple of games, 6 points, 11 points, 10 points. And then, look, that's really the only downfall, right? You think of every other game, it's just been average, mediocre, 13, 7, 12. He's wide receiver 46 with all these double-digit mediocre games. And he also did miss a game in week 7. He also had his bye, so maybe that does also affect it. But he hasn't been this boom player that we all hoped and expect for him getting, multiple touchdowns or whatever the case may be. He just hasn't been that player. he is a must start coming into this week, but don't have high expectations for DK Metcalf because, once again, he is a star. Tyler Lockett, on the other hand, has been a little bit more consistent. When you really think of the fantasy ups and downs that we all have also expected, we always say Tyler Lockett is a boom bust play. He could have, these 25-point plus games, or he can have, these under 10 double-digit games, right? We've seen it 25-8, to over 25 fantasy points, 8 fantasy points, 9 fantasy points, 15 fantasy points, 7 fantasy points, 22 fantasy points. And then he just had 6 fantasy points against the Baltimore Ravens. And he is the one that I believe could have a field day against the Washington Commanders, as they currently give up the 3rd most amount of points to the wide receiver position. So definitely keep that in mind. Jackson Smith and Jigba is a spot star. If you are in a deeper league, maybe there's other options that you have here. I think each and any one of these guys could eat coming into this week. I just don't know who is going to be. And we saw Jackson Smith and Jigba getting more opportunity as well. 82% of the snap share, his highest snap share this year so far against the Baltimore Ravens, caught 6 out of 7. He outscored Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf this week and out-targeted them. So, he didn't out-target, Tyler Lockett. He out-targeted DK Metcalf. So this is where you can probably see the switch. So keep that in mind. Those are my guys. Once again, so many confusing things. Comment down below if you have any questions regarding this matchup. Okay, going into our Sunday night matchup of this week, Jets at the Las Vegas Raiders. Shout out to the Raiders. Favorites coming into this game are the New York Jets. 37 is the over-under. And the Jets side of the ball, obviously, you start Garrett Wilson. Now, he hasn't been that high up wide receiver one that we all expected and hope for at coming into this year, obviously, with Aaron Rodgers. But now with Zach Wilson, he's still getting peppered with those targets here. Caught 7 out of 13 targets for over 13 fantasy points. If he finds the end zone in any one of these games, he could have a massive opportunity. The Vegas are actually really good against the pass, but anything can happen when it comes down to some of these teams because they fluctuate up and down when you think of the Raiders and when you also think of the Jets. Now going to the Raiders side of the ball, Davante Adams and Jacoby Myers. Let's not think about this too much. You start both of these guys. Obviously, Davante Adams had been seeing a lot more inconsistency, something that I have expected coming into this year. I wasn't expecting Jimmy G to get benched or anything, or Josh McDaniels to get fired. But I did say that it was going to be very inconsistent. We've seen that in the past. You can see it in the past, since week 5, 8 fantasy points, 4, 12 fantasy points, 2 fantasy points, 7 fantasy points. Now he's going against the Jets, who currently give up the least amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. You have to expect that Sauce Gardner is going to be matching up with Davante Adams. Not saying that he can't outperform him, not saying that he's still not Davante Adams and he's still a top 3 wide receiver. He is. I truly believe that. But, you have to take things with a grain of salt when you're going against a good defense, especially against a good corner. He's still a must start in my eyes, so keep that in mind. Jacoby Myers as well is also still a must start. He didn't get the targets that we were hoping and expecting, but look, he does get over 13 fantasy points, gets 2 out of 5 targets. He does get the end zone by rushing the ball this past week, so that actually really helped his cause. So let's wait and see what that looks like with the Jets. This might be a tough matchup for Jacoby Myers, but all these guys, once again, are must-starts going into Week 10. Okay, going into our Monday night matchup, Broncos at the Buffalo Bills here. This one could be an interesting game. Starting off the Broncos side of the ball here, Courtland Sutton is the only must start here that I believe that you can plug and play. He has been consistent. He has only had 1 game under double-digit fantasy points, and that was week 5 against the Jets. So keep that in mind with Davante Adams and Jacoby Myers. Obviously, nowhere near the talent and the quarterback and or offense, obviously, of course. But what's interesting is that he has scored a touchdown in every single game but 2. So out of the 8 games he has played, he has scored a touchdown in 6 out of the 8 games. Whether it's garbage time, whether it's not garbage time, he is scoring a touchdown, which is giving you a safe floor each and every week. So he is a must-start coming into this week for me. Now going to Jerry Jeudy. Once again, someone else that has been very fluctuating, caught 2 out of 6 targets against Kansas City, but does find the end zone, which saves his day here. Not somebody I'm excited to start against the Buffalo Bills. They are a middle-of-the-pack defense. But you have to expect these games to get a little bit better. Russell Wilson has been cooking a little bit and has been spreading the ball around. right? So we got to wait and see what's going to happen with Jerry Jeudy. Not somebody that I am going to be starting. He's not a must start, excuse me, but he is a spot start depending on your depth in your league. Going to the Bills side of the ball, obviously you start Stephon Diggs, right? You start Stephon Diggs. He's wide receiver 3 on this year. Let's not waste any more time there. Now you have to think of Gabe Davis. This is the interesting one here. I mean, we saw in week 8 against Tampa and 9 out of 12 targets over 23 fantasy points. Against Cincinnati, 0 fantasy points, had 2 targets. This is the problem with Gabe Davis. Very inconsistent. Not sure if we can trust him. How can we start him? When can we start him? He's always going to be a risky start moving forward. So definitely keep that in mind. Now, somebody that I believe you should pick up and stash, not saying you should start him, he's not even on this list, is Khalil Shakir. If you're in a 14, 16-man league, in a deeper league, he has been seeing a significantly more amount of snap share and a significantly more amount of opportunity and targets. So keep that in mind. Let's see one more week of Shakir, and if he does continue, but he is somebody that you should be picking up and stashing, specifically coming into week 10 if you do need some wide receiver help here, guys. Hopefully this helps you. Once again, every single matchup, every single wide receiver that I can possibly talk about in a span of 40 minutes coming into this video. So I hope this helped. We appreciate each and every one of you. Make sure you drop a like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, it's all love.
Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, L-A-N-D, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh,
it's so easy, even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.